This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to books and ideas and everything in between. This episode is brought to you by Yeshiva University's Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs and the university's Center for Israel Studies. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and my guest today is Professor of French and English at Yeshiva University. She is the author of the forthcoming book, Before Trans, 3 Gender Stories from 19th-Century France. It will be published later this year by Stanford University Press. Dr. Rachel Mesch, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you so much for having me.
So your book tells a story of Jeanne Dieulafoy, Rachel and Marc de Montifaux, am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yes.
Yeah? 3 Parisian women, dare I say socialites, who pushed the boundaries of the very strict gender identities that prevailed at the time. So before we delve into their stories and what the stories mean, can you please briefly tell us about the 3 of them and why you thought it made sense to include them together in the same monograph?
Sure. So I come to this as a scholar of women writers during this time period, which is the late 19th century, early 20th century in France. And really, my decision to include these 3 really is the story of how this book came to be, because I didn't sit down and say, okay, I want to write about transgender identity in the 19th century. And so what happened was, having written, my last book was about women writers in French women's magazines, the first French women's magazines in the 1900s, and this kind of image of femininity that emerged that was a way of reconciling femininity and feminism. And in the context of these hyper-feminized images that were there that were sort of combating this idea of the woman writer as the blue stocking who was dowdy and threatening and horrible and destroying French families, that book was about these images, photographs of women writers who were presented as hyper-feminine. It was called Having It All in the Belle Epoque, and it was about reconciling feminism and family and showing how women writers are not threatening at all. So in the context of that, I came across Jeanne Dieulafoy, who was the only one in these magazines. She was another one of these celebrity women writers, so to speak, and she was always the only one wearing pants. And not only wearing pants, have you seen it's hard for me to actually speak without all of my images. There are, I think, about 65 of them in the book. It's also a book that's about early photography, in a sense, and early media culture. But in these amazing photographs of her in these women's magazines, she would be alongside her husband wearing beautifully tailored men's suit. And so I sort of couldn't figure that out in the context of that book. And it was like, all right, let me look into that later. I knew it would sort of...
Just to say, one of the many things that blew my mind in the book is that she had to get a special permit from the police to do that, to wear men's clothes.
That law, fun fact, was removed in 2013. So it was illegal. I mean, obviously, French women had been wearing pants long before that, but it was illegal until 2013 for French women to wear pants in Paris without a permit. So all 3 of these figures needed a pants permit, and it's called a permission de travestissement, a transvestism permit, actually. And they either secured it or tried to secure it in different ways, and those stories are in there as well. So what I did, after finishing that when that second book came out, I was sort of bereft, having really enjoyed writing it, and thought I'll never write another book again. But this was my path. I'm going to go explore Jeanne Dieulafoy and see what that is all about. And everyone talked about it. There was nothing secret about the fact that she wore pants, she was married, she was ultra-Catholic, super conservative, and she dressed like a man. She wore her hair super short, and that was just, period. And I was like, that's not a period, that's a question mark. What's going on there? And so I actually thought I was writing a book about marriage, because she was married, and there are other examples. Actually, all 3 of my figures were married. And so I was interested in these kind of marriages of the mind in this particular moment in time. I quickly found that there was much more. Jeanne Dieulafoy had written a lot more than her husband, Marcel, and was a much more interesting, at least to me, figure. And I started reading these historical novels that she wrote. So a lot of what I do in my research is look at women's novels from this time period that were often very popular in their time and that no one has read since. But because French people keep their books, and if you've been to Paris, you can, a lot of these, I have copies because I literally found them at a bouquiniste along the Seine. So that's part of the romance of being a French professor. The perks is we get to do things like that.
Yeah. You get research grants to go to Paris.
Yes, poor us, right? So anyway, and so I happened upon the magazines actually first that way, but then I have this collection, also eBay, and that's a whole other thing. But because of this time period is not that far away, and because French people tend to cherish their books and other kinds of items, you can have these physical things. And they were in libraries, like you find them in major university libraries in the United States. They have Dieulafoy, Rachil's, even Montefiaux's books, because they ordered them in the 1890s. In the 1900s and the 1920s and the reproductions. So anyway, I'm sort of pick up this huge novel about, it's a historical novel about the Crusades. And I'm thinking like, I have to slog my way through this and see if there's anything worth, looking at here. And all of a sudden, girls are turning into boys and cutting off their hair. I mean, I was literally gasping out loud. That's sort of my favorite research moments, or when I'm like, oh my, what is happening here? Can this be? And of course, this is very much informed by it being at the time, I don't know, around 2014, 2015, when trans is in the air. I've read some recent trans memoirs. People are starting to talk about this, really just starting. And I'm seeing this stuff and it's just making sense to me in a totally different way. And I'm stunned, And so I think, okay, that's clearly the story that I'm telling here. And it got me thinking, as a scholar of, so many other women writers at the time, that there were a few other women who, quote unquote, resist categorization and whom I've written about. I've written about Rachel before. And it was always this like painful process of trying to make sense of her. And I thought of the most famous novel, Monsieur Vénus, which is often studied in American classrooms, at least recently, because in the past 30 years, because it is so gender bendy and there's so much going on there. And I thought, is there something going on there? We've thought about queer Rachel, and she's challenging gender norms in all sorts of ways in her novels. And I just thought, well, what about the trans lens here? And that made me start to think about these two together. And so it actually started as those two who are very, very different. One being ultra-conservative and religious, and the other one a rebel who embraced that rebel identity to a certain degree. And so it was started as this sort of like, well, look at these two different people using various narrative structures, discourses of their day to make sense of their identities at a time when this category had not yet been articulated.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that, today it's more and more normal to, consider these categories. At the time, to an extent, to a large extent, it was quite transgressive. Yet these characters were not at all ostracized and marginalized by their society. Well, maybe not at all, but they had a public profile. They were, upper middle class Parisians. How do you explain that? The fact that they were, it was more normal than you'd expect.
Right. And that is another important reframe for this time period where we, there's a whole question of presentism in literary history and other kinds of history. Like, how much are we reading through the present? And of course, we're always reading through the present. And part of what I'm trying to do with my work is to sort of disrupt the 1950s present through which we've sort of codified how we read these writers and use the updated categories to see them more deeply without saying, this is exactly, while being sensitive to the historical and cultural context. These writers existed in society in different ways and in overlapping elements of society. My biggest puzzle with Dieulafoy, this first one, who was very much in this upper crust academic circle. Her husband was a member of the Académie Française, which is the ultimate, most conservative institution in France. And so part of the thrill of this research, in order to go into the archives, so this is also part of why this research is possible, is because he was a quote-unquote immortal. If you're elected to the Académie Française, women couldn't be elected until the 1980s, fun fact. But he was, and if you're elected, you become an immortal. And his archives are there, and therefore her archives are there, and that's why I had access to all this stuff. And in order to be allowed into this library, you actually have to get permission from an immortal to do so. And so you do that by writing to them, and it's not that hard. But I didn't say, oh, I'm working on transgender. Can I come and look at this stuff? And so every time I go in there, the most conservative place, in French society, I do it with the kind of knowledge of what it is that my own little subversion there. So, but yeah, you could get away with these things to the extent that, look, she was married and she wasn't challenging social structures. In fact, and I think one of the most compelling and poignant parts of Jane Dieulafoy's story is the way in which she tried to inscribe her own life into a Catholic and conservative narrative. As opposed to saying, this culture doesn't see me, doesn't accept me, she said, I'm going to find my way in. And I think that piece of it is a struggle that we can relate to in various ways, the ways in which we try to find a place for ourselves in something that's really culturally or religiously important to us as a kind of grand narrative. And so she saw herself as a modern day Joan of Arc. And that was the novel that I'm referring to.
Yeah. No, the interesting thing, actually, it segues neatly into my next question, that cross-dressing did exist at the time and even before Joan of Arc, but it had a very functional purpose, right? Joan of Arc did it to fight in the army. The other people who were cross-dressers did it mainly for entertainment purposes. It seems that these women in your book, it was almost invisible, right? The cross-dressing. Yeah? It was like so much embedded in their lifestyle that it was almost as if they weren't making a statement.
It depends on each one, but there is a way in which, for Dieulafoy in particular, her doing it, people sort of looked at her and said, well, that's her. You can't imagine her in a skirt. That's just her. And they made excuses for her. Rachel was a different case. And the three are very different cases. And that's part of the work that my book does also, which is to say, these are people embodying their gender nonconformity in as many different ways as, one can be human. And so Rachel came from a very different background. And she attempted suicide. She struggled with depression. And for her, it was an ongoing struggle to understand herself. She didn't find herself neatly falling into a kind of comfortable conservative narrative. Instead, she was reading the medical literature of the time and the decadent literature of the time, which saw her as an hysteric, as someone who was mentally ill. She feared she was mentally ill. And one can imagine that if you are born and living as what we would now maybe identify as trans and identified and know yourself to be a gender which is not the one assigned to you and not the one that people are treating you as, we know that makes people, that it's a terrifying and very lonely and alienating experience, especially outside of language. And so these are the stories of how people tried to make sense of that and how these are writers fundamentally and how they embraced storytelling to sort of render their lives. And I just wanted to comment, you are referring to them as women, and I do that as well. It's tricky because, of course, they're not, we have these historical examples now of people who actually lived as the opposite sex and were married, and there are women who truly lived as men and were married to women in the 19th century and before then. That's not what I'm documenting here. And so it's harder to say, they didn't. In some cases, some of them did identify as men or sort of disguise themselves, quote unquote, as men or wrote under male pseudonyms. But it's the language, it's the ability to talk about it is quite challenging. And the reason why I pause on it is because I don't want to misgender them. And one of the things that's been very difficult in really seeing them and hearing their stories for what they were, is the lens that feminism has offered, right? They've been seen as rebellious women. And it's very hard to push against that and to sort of let this land. This is a reframe that requires us to say it's not the same as being a rebellious woman. Feminism is helpful here. It's in a lot of important work here. But I also, they in some cases have as much in common as some of the other women who were pushing against gender binaries and hierarchies as men who were gender nonconforming at the time.
Because you also write in the book that feminism did exist to an extent in many forms in France at the time, yet their experience and they themselves are pretty much alienated from it. And if we look at it today, gender identity is seen as some sort of an offshoot or a derivative of feminism and women emancipation. And it's interesting that you make a point that this is not so for them, not only chronologically, that they didn't follow the other, but also that, in real terms, they didn't really have a lot of interest in
right. Well, you can imagine
the
the frustration, right? Rachel actually wrote a pamphlet called, and you have to understand, she was a kind of larger than life figure, rebellious, part of the Bohemian literary circuit. So a very different social group than Dieu la foi, the straight-laced Dieu la foi. But people were constantly, as feminism was on the rise in the 1880s, people kept wanting to comment on it and assumed that she was a feminist because of her, for reasons that we can understand. And it drove her crazy. And she eventually, in the 1920s, wrote a pamphlet called Why I'm Not a Feminist. This did not stop, the American scholars, myself included, of the 90s and early 2000s of saying, well, okay, feminism at the time meant advocating for suffrage, and it had a very specific political valence. It wasn't about the personal as political. So now, if in a more expansive notion of feminism as pushing against gender hierarchies, we can recognize the feminist work, and to a degree we can. But if you're someone who knows themselves fundamentally to not be a woman, and people keep coming up to you and saying, "Oh, so you're a feminist," right? That's where her irritation, and it really comes out, it's irritation. And so that pamphlet, which, at the end of it, she basically says, why am I not a feminist? Because I'm not a woman. And it's pretty much there. And everyone, and throughout her life, she said it over and over. She called herself a werewolf. She called herself a monster. She called herself a hysteric. She called herself, she was trying to understand and tried out all kinds of different labels for what she was. And she sort of said it louder and louder over time because no one could hear it. No one could absorb it. And even myself, my earlier writing about it, before trans was a category, was a way of us understanding gender nonconformity, I didn't hear it either. And that was what was so striking to me, going back to some of the works that I had encountered earlier in my study, in my PhD, in my first book, and saying like, whoa, this is actually quite explicit. As you can see from the photographs also, which are also telling a story that exceeds language in a certain way.
Despite the caveats against anachronism that, have made here and do make in the book, let me perhaps turn that on its head and say, how do these women's experiences shed light on our modern understanding of gender identity, gender studies, etc.?
In terms of, kind of take it academically, I think it opens up the way that we think about history, and we're always gendering. We assume that when someone's talking about trans, they're sort of imposing something. But the assumption for this time period and so many others is that everybody is heterosexual and gender normative. Because, despite there being clear, or when there's not clear evidence to the contrary, people aren't always, leaving memoirs that say, this is exactly how I'm feeling. It will be understood approximately in 2015. What I'm asking to do as a scholar is to kind of open that up and listen and not presume as much, and especially for this time period, which I called the non-binary 19th century. There's sort of so many examples, which is part of what made them able to sort of exist in society, of people pushing in this way. In terms of what it brings to the present, I think it's, that's trickier in a sense. I really just truly believe in the power of people's stories. And I think that, for myself in writing this, I spent a tremendous amount of time reading contemporary trans stories, trans memoirs, first person, not theories about trans, but people speaking about their own trans experiences all across the spectrum, by trans men, trans women, non-binary, gender fluid, just to hear those voices and really live with that. And that allowed me to hear better and to pick up on the stories that were being told by these writers. And it just allows me to hear better in general. I'm kind of obsessed with podcasts in general. So
Great.
This is very exciting for me. But part of what I love about podcasts is that opening into other people's lives and their stories. And I just feel that is just, it's immersive in that way. It makes me a better reader. And, it makes you, I think it makes you a better person in the end of the day. So that's, kind of my generic, what I think it brings.
Yeah. Do you think there's anything specifically French about their experiences? I mean, is there anything about late 19th century France that allowed for these quite unusual stories? Or do you think, or do you know that there are similar stories in other cultural centers in England or Germany or America?
It's a good question. And of course, I can't speak for, what's happening. I haven't studied those other places and times in the same way. And it was it came later in my analysis to think about exactly that. Why now? Why are these three people existing in the same place and time? It helped me to be writing about these three people who existed in the same place and time and looking at how different their approaches were. What is specific to 19th century Paris is that you have the beginning of the mass media right now and mass culture, and you have a shift in educational laws that allows, or it makes it mandatory for women to go to do secondary schooling. And the sort of unforeseen consequences of that move, which was meant to separate the church from these young women who were being educated in the convent and sort of to disempower the church. But in the end, what it did is educated women, and when you educate women, equality follows, or at least, the quest for it. And so women were writing in greater numbers than ever before. There were more places to publish their work because the mass press was exploding. And the French were particularly interested in gender and sexuality. They were writing, the 19th century novel is consumed with Balzac, Gautier, Flaubert, Zola. They're all talking about gender in one way or another. And that made it possible for these stories to be written to a certain degree. They sort of opened up the possibility of what kind of stories could be told. And you could tell gender-bendy stories. We live in that moment now as well. It's the moment, I always say in my classes, it's the moment that 19th century Paris created. We are living in that reality, the age of the internet, that is anticipated by Baudelaire and everything that was happening in 19th century Paris. And so we can relate to the way in which you can look around in culture and read a novel or see a television series and recognize yourself in that and expand the ways in which you understand yourself. That was happening with the 19th century press and with 19th century novels. And Jane Geoffroy kept a little scrapbook. It was mostly of places where she was mentioned in the news because she was a celebrity and also noticed for wearing pants. She was a celebrity because she went to Persia. This is my little Jewish tie-in, by the way, so I have it, okay? So here's the Jewish studies tie-in. Jane Geoffroy went with her husband Marcel, who was a civil engineer and architecture buff, to Shushan, to Susa, and brought back parts of it that are on display in the Louvre to this day. And so in those travels, she actually kind of had the room. So that's when she started wearing pants for good because it was more, she couldn't travel as a French woman. She would have to travel veiled to show a female face. And so she traveled as a French man, basically, and became famous, became a celebrity for bringing those things back to the Louvre and bringing glory to France in the process. So now I've forgotten the question that I was
about the specifically French attributes.
Oh, yeah. Right. So her scrapbook. That is why she had so many things in her scrapbook, because she was often being cited around town. But the scrapbook contains all the ways in which her gender nonconformity was assimilated in the time. And so it has newspaper articles that say, women dressing as men, this is terrible. And ones that say, oh, feminism. And ones that say, oh, this, intrepid explorer. And you can sort of watch the ways in which she's reacting to that and saying, no, I'm not that. Or am I that? And you see that play out in her stories. The scrapbook is from approximately the same time as these novels. And the novels are kind of explicitly writing back against these media narratives. So you can see how there's a back and forth, and the way in which her story is elaborated in response, in part, to the 19th century media.
All three women were very prolific writers, not just writers, but very prolific. And I was thinking maybe there is some sort of link, perhaps inextricable, between their gender identity and their really voracious passion for the written word.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's what struck me as well. This kind of, and it's something that connects with other modern trans writing. Many modern trans writers talk about this kind of impulse to narrative. No matter how many books, they talk about recognizing themselves in other people's stories, but they also talk about, well, that's not quite it. And if you exist outside of language, you're gifted with the ability to write, there's this impulse to render yourself in language that I saw in so many of these modern trans writers that was anticipated in these three writers. This kind of continual return to the question, trying to write themselves through and out of this kind of conundrum. And so I, especially with Rachel, but with Montifaux as well, and we haven't really talked about, it's a kind of compulsive writing. They talk about writing as if in a trance. And there's a reworking of their story, which is in part because of the absence of a collective understanding of what it was, what their existence meant, or how to translate that into the words. And also because identities are in flux and they shift over time. And so they're sort of trying out different narratives in the different styles with which they were more comfortable and familiar. For Dieulafoy, it was this more kind of historical fiction. And for Rachel, it was decadence. For Montifaux, it was pornography. No, it was deemed pornography. It was more of a kind of Zola-esque, novel that wasn't afraid to deal with eroticism.
Now, perhaps a methodological question about actually finding the sources. I mean, you said that you were looking for the books, and part of the exploration was through the writing. But what about the biographies? I mean, I'm just asking that to try and understand to what extent they are forgotten or are obscure or part still of, some sort of, the discourse in France today. In Dieulafoy's case, as you said, it's easier because her husband was an academician, so it was all available. But what about the other two?
Well, in terms of whether there was available and whether they're known are two separate things, right? Rachel has had a kind of comeback. These were all very popular and best-selling and celebrities of their time. But Rachel has been rediscovered, as I said, through gender studies in America and a little bit in France. And she has an immense archive as well. And she was the editor, she was a literary editor of the Mercure de France, which her husband had restarted in the late 19th century and was a huge literary journal, very influential literary journal. And she had a huge influence because she did the book reviews. So people were trying to always get in her good graces, and they had a salon that people attended. And so they were very well known. And there's just an immense number of manuscripts and archives there. Montifaux is the sparsest, but there's an archive of hers in the feminist library, the Marguerite Durand in Paris, that has some really interesting letters and materials. And Dieulafoy, of course, as I said. And so because they were all so prolific, I mean, there's tons of manuscripts. Of course, as a scholar, you're looking for that secret letter that says, this is how I feel, and I haven't said it anywhere else. But there was a lot of material to work with. I was doing that in tandem. It's incredible to work with the archives and to look at their handwriting, which actually the French are firm believers in handwriting analysis. But Dieulafoy's handwriting, as you might imagine, is very neat. The margins is kind of stereotypical with the ruler, whereas Rachel is literally writing in the margins of every sheet of paper she ever came across, and would never say, there's these kind of formulas in French writing where you have to say, dear so-and-so, and then you have these elaborate formulas for signing off, which of course Dieulafoy always used. And Rachel is just jumps right in and would always end with her name in the middle of this clever ending sentence and just cut off, and then there's no more room on the paper. And Montifaux, we have very little of her own writing left, actually.
Yeah, you also write that they knew about each other's existence. Did they see themselves as part of a network of sorts? What was really the relationship between them?
So now you're getting to the Netflix series part of my imagination, because in my Netflix version, I have so many good storylines. They were often mentioned together in the newspapers. Dieulafoy and Montifaux bared a certain bore a certain resemblance to one another. So they were sometimes mistaken for each other. And there's some fun little newspaper accounts of that. They had many overlapping friends and acquaintances in the Paris literary world, which wasn't, that enormous at the time. And so they surely knew of each other. And Rachel mentions in passing, sort of dismissively, the other two. But they were not friends. And, my assumption is that in addition to really being part of different cliques, let's say, it would have been frightening they weren't sort of, none of them were out or could embrace this, whatever this gender nonconformity was, as a kind of identity. It would have been too much. They didn't acknowledge it out loud in any sort of way. On the other hand, the three of them, and this is one of the things that I found really interesting, they were all in various ways looking to history and looking to other models, looking to find their gender nonconforming kin and to see reflections of themselves. And so there are a few historical figures that all three of them refer to, like the Chevalier d'Eon was an 18th century Chevalier knight who, these sort of famous cross-dressers of history. And so even though they weren't cross-dressers per se, in the sense that I argue this is not about cross-dressing, this is not performance, this is about an expression of self, and that's an important distinction. They were looking to see themselves in some wider narrative, and that's where they also overlap.
All right, so we have a bit of time for questions. Over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. It's so interesting. I was really struck by the word werewolf and just the search to reinvent language. And I was just wondering if you saw kind of some ways in which their use of language impacted either the vernacular or the academic, or just any kind of carryover of their own reinvention of language.
That's a very interesting question. So Rachel saw herself as a werewolf because once you understand that the gender binary is not a kind of definitive break between two things, the difference between the human and the animal world doesn't seem as definitive either. And so she thought maybe she was a cat. She sort of looked around and said, I don't see anyone who's like me, so maybe I'm really something else. And she was not entirely joking. She started to say it more and more often in her old age. But like many things, it was a way of her declaring her difference and making her difference visible without naming it in a kind of way that anybody really understood. So people didn't pick up on it enough for it to have landed in the vernacular in any kind of way. And what was so interesting to me, part of what's so interesting to me as a literary scholar about this project is how profoundly literary that fundamental issue was, right? How do I render myself into language? And that's something that, as someone who studied, semiotics in the 90s as an undergraduate, that's where it all begins. Once you realize language is totally arbitrary, and that gap between word and thing. So I saw them all working that out in the same way. And really, that's what made them writers, is trying. And so one of the points that I make here is that I'm not trying to say this is trans, this is a particular label. My point is that the question is, how do you describe in language something that exceeds language? And the way that you do that, and that we do all the time, is through narrative. It's through stories. Our identities are built on the stories that we tell ourselves. And that is fundamentally what this book is about, recovering those stories, listening for them, finding them in their biographies, in their published works, in their letters, in the way those things are all woven together, and trying to pull that out in a way that is sensitive to them and doesn't impose our current understanding too much on it, while sort of putting on those glasses so that we can see those things that we might not have been able to see without that kind of paradigm shift.
Following up on the language question. So for me, when I studied French, it was very much a gendered experience, right? Everything is either masculine or feminine. Did that at all play into their writing?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things you see and what Rachel is known for is her playing with pronouns. The pronoun question, which, remains today, and which, by the way, is not so much about we're going to find, no, now we have this perfect way of saying it. We have they, we have other kind of ways of reinventing language. The thing that links past to present is the difficulty, is the fact that we can't translate ourselves into language, or that when you're gender nonconforming, it's that much more difficult. For all of us, it's difficult, right? We all have to work to write our own stories. So not all languages only have those two terms, and there's all kinds of examples that are thrown around in Thailand and other places where there's a third gender. And so presumably, in those, and not just presumably, people have written about, if you're born into those cultures, you're experiencing your gender fluidity in a different kind of way. In French, as in English, it's a binary language. There are male and female pronouns, even more gendered, right? Because you have to agree with gender. And there's all those rules in French language.
And they doesn't work in French.
And they is gendered, kind of like in Hebrew. Yeah, so there's new third-person gender pronouns. Also, France is in a different place regarding all of these questions. And for me to talk about trans in France is, the academy isn't quite where we are, or culturally where we are in the States. So these things tend to be very culturally specific. So, and that's been a battle throughout. I mean, you have someone like Rachel and Marc de Montifaux who took great pleasure in using male pronouns and sort of quote unquote tricking, right? Having people believe that she was in fact a male writer. And she seemed to very much enjoy that. And yet she also was, lived as a woman, and I wasn't prepared to change the pronouns in talking about her historically. What I say in the book is that academically, what we don't have a term for yet is for women who might have, or people who were assigned female at birth, right, lived as women, did not necessarily identify themselves or see themselves as women, but at the same time lived in patriarchy, were treated as women. We don't have a category for that. So yes, they couldn't vote, right? They struggled. They didn't have access to all the things that men at their time had. And could be part of why it was better to wear pants. But that wasn't the prevailing reason when you look at their writing and their work collectively. And so how do we acknowledge that they were living in a historical time and being treated as women in that time, but also acknowledge their gender difference and not sort of flatten that category and ignore all of the gender expression and gender identity stuff that is also at work there. That's where feminism as a discipline, feminist history and French history and French literary history hasn't quite kind of factored that in and figured out how to talk about those things. So that's part of what the work that this book is trying to do.
Thank you, Rachel. Could you talk a little bit about the development or the evolution of their self-expression and what exactly they were saying and how they were appearing in public early on in their careers, or even during adolescence, and then how it may have changed or developed later into their careers as they got older?
Well, there's about 300 pages of that coming to you in May, but that is, no, I get it. No, but that is basically, they are these three biographies that attempt to do just that. We don't know that much about most of their adolescence. We know a little bit about Rachel, and each one of them has a very different story. Dieulafoy rose to battle with her husband in the Franco-Prussian War, which broke out shortly after she was married. She did not want to be the sort of... normally when women would follow their husbands to war, they would be like giving, the Florence Nightingale. She didn't want to do that. She became a sharpshooter. That was the first time she wore pants. And the rest of her life was sort of trying to recapture the glory of that and the pleasure of that. And so then she went to Persia, had another excuse to wear pants. And because she became a hero through that journey, she was able to come back and say, okay, I have to keep doing this. And we don't have sort of beyond what she writes about in the novels, where we get the kind of emotional infusion investment of the changing of the clothing. We don't know much more than that. But she went on to wear these beautifully tailored men's suits alongside her husband for the rest of her life. And people just seemed to accept it because she was Jane Dieulafoy and she was amazing and charming. She would just charm everyone. And they would say, oh, well, she wore pants in the army, so that's why, or she wore pants in Persia, willing to ignore the fact that when she was in Persia and in the army, the pants she wore looked nothing like her beautiful suits, which apparently she sometimes wore with a cardboard board over her chest to disguise her femininity. And so she had this kind of amazingly optimistic narrative where she was the hero. She was, Joan of Arc, basically, and God wanted her to wear pants. And that is sort of throughout. For God and masculinity for God and country is the kind of gender story that I tell for her. But you have these little windows into the vulnerability in the fact that she had that scrapbook and that she had a series of unpublished histories of cross-dressing, gender nonconforming historical figures that she never published. And so you see that there was this continued writing, continued quest, continued working every decade, every few years of this question. And that's sort of what I trace. But it's mostly an optimistic story. And then Rachel, as I said before, really struggled with all of her complicated emotional feelings about it, and was a kind of rebellious teen, left home as soon as she could, tried to make it on her own in Paris, in Bohemian Paris, and wrote her Succès de Scandale, her breakthrough novel, Monsieur Vénus, which I mentioned before, as she described it as this 2-week trance that she published in Belgium because you could basically get paid to publish anything kind of sexy there. It was immediately censored. She was sentenced to prison in Belgium, which she avoided by staying in Paris. And that launched her career, sort of accidentally. And as I argue in the book, what happened there was she suddenly, everyone was like, oh, she's a crazy, hysterical person. And she sort of was initially alarmed by that and then finally said, well, I guess it's out of the closet. I can be whoever I want now. And embraced that kind of indecipherability and was just like, yep, I'm your monster, crazy woman, rebellious, whatever you want. Then she gets pregnant/married, unclear what happens when exactly, partly because of her depression and because of just this feeling of being at sea. And so she wore pants during the Parisian bohemian years. And so then marries the guy who's the editor of the Mercure de France and has this kind of more stable life, but still is writing these fictions that are kind of railing against all kinds of things. And people think about that early novel as its kind of own thing. But in fact, she was writing all these novels about animals, werewolf type of creatures, that if you understand it through that lens, you realize, oh, it's kind of the same question. It's like people becoming animals. And so there's so much angst that's left there. And it's sort of been read as like, oh, those were her crazy Parisian, self-promoting years. And she settled down. And that's really the narrative I wanted to push against, that she didn't stop being Rachel once she got married. She described her marriage as a kind of suicide, actually. And she was not in love with her husband. It was a partnership that was sort of keeping her alive by providing a roof over her head and a job and a desk and letting her continue to write. And then Montifaux is a totally different story where, which I haven't really spoken about, but is fascinating and totally different, where she is writing under the pseudonym Marc de Montifaux, then has a son and names him Marc after herself, and keeps getting sent to prison for pornography for these kind of Christian historical rewritings. And I think that she started as an art critic, I should say, and wrote for many years under the pseudonym Marc de Montifaux. There's still art critics to this day, scholars who don't realize that Marc de Montifaux was who she was. And I think that there was a segment of the readership that was actually very troubled when they found out that she was a woman. And that this sort of disproportionate response to these books that were sort of barely pornographic was partly about this feeling of being duped and this kind of gender duping. And so she kept getting sent to prison. And, people kept saying, well, just stop writing the books. And she couldn't, and she wouldn't. And she was so angry. So she has this kind of seething rage that runs through everything. And, and then what basically her turning point is, this is a really fun story that I tell in the book, so I won't tell the whole thing, but basically she's featured as Madame de Sade in a fictional version of her life, which very much angers her, not so much because she's Madame de Sade, the pornography writer, but because the story makes it seem like her husband was the brains behind it all. And so she takes the newspaper in which this appears, goes to the opera with her husband, sees the editor, and in this whole premeditated act, slaps him on the face with it. Now must flee the country once again. At that moment, when she slaps him, she is dressed in the men's clothing that she would then take on. And in the book, you can see the series of photographs as her gender expression is evolving. And then she kind of settles into this. For me, that's a kind of coming out moment. She's sort of like gives the finger to the editor. It's like, I got to go into exile a little bit longer. But then kind of gets it out of her system and is able to sort of stabilize in this identity that feels more aligned with who she is. And then she takes on a new male pseudonym and keeps writing for some time. But there's a lot of questions that are unanswered. These are suggestive in a lot of ways because the archives are incomplete. And the stories are stories, so they're open to interpretation.
Do we have time for one last question? Or
So many questions, but I will just limit to one in particular. You've hinted at, you've talked about, you said that de la Foi, if I'm saying it right, was a devout Catholic. Does she talk explicitly about squaring this circle here, or kind of figuring this out as a devout Catholic?
Not explicitly, because she never explicitly acknowledges that there's anything different about her. But in this book that I was alluding to called Frère Pélage, which is the story that takes place during the Crusades and is the sort of Joan of Arc narrative, this woman is supposed to be engaged. She's promised herself to God, and then it's complicated. But she goes into the woods, chops off her hair, changes her clothes, and becomes a monk. Not a nun, like she could have kind of run off to the convent, but so that's sort of a little plot hole there. And that's the story to me that most clearly mirrors her life. This character ends up married to, is pining for her fiance, who is, it's actually a kind of Joseph's story, actually, and which she refers to the biblical Joseph story throughout this, actually, meaning that once her fiance returns, she's in this monastery. Of course, the sister and the father and the fiance return, they don't recognize her. And she has this angst because she's become Brother Pelagius. Does she reveal herself to be their sister, fiance, Marguerite, who she is no longer, right? Or who she never was? Or, right, it's this kind of identity struggle. And how do you recognize, it's a kind of scene of recognition that echoes the Joseph story, in which eventually she says, I am your sister, daughter, fiance. And it's a desire to be seen as different and yet the same. And it's a really poignant and also crazy, complicated narrative. But that's where you see her saying, see, I'm in the narrative. And the Joan of Arc part, who's a religious figure as well. And it all makes sense. And I'm going to marry Christ here. And it sort of gets worked out, but with just enough drama and tension to show that actually, there's a lot of vulnerability underneath it all.
Right. Dr. Rachel Mesch, the author of the forthcoming book, Before Trans, 3 Gender Stories from 19th-Century France. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And also many thanks to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to Yeshiva University for supporting this series. You too can support us by going to our website at tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 500 interviews. And if you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel, as well as following me and my co-host Dalia Shendlin on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.